Hi, I'm Reverend Paula Skiles, minister of Unity Church of San Marcos. I'd like to share a story with you about two young boys. We'll call them Billy and Johnny. Now, they're climbing in an old apple orchard, and they're holding on to the highest limbs, the small, tiny limbs at the top of this old tree, and they're walking out on this one bough. Unfortunately, that limb is rotten, and what happens? They both fall and hit the ground. And of course, you know the result is somebody's probably going to get hurt. Well, sure enough, little Johnny is moaning, and he looks over and he sees young Billy getting up, brushing himself off with a smile, and he says, "Why ain't you hurt? You were further out on the limb than I was." And Billy says, "I prayed." And now, young Johnny's like, "You didn't have no time to pray. He was up there after all." And Billy's response, though, was, "I prayed ahead of time. I was prayed up. And I didn't have to worry. I knew I didn't have nothing to be afraid of. I would be all right." Now, this rather simplistic parable tells us, and it points to a very powerful effect of the disconnect from sin that being prayed up is about. And what is sin? It's those unwise choices that you and I make based on negative energies, or when you and I cause harm in some way to ourselves or others from those choices. It's not listening to that intuitive part of our being and going against something we feel we should be doing and yet respond impulsively, negatively. And it's falling short. Literally, sin meaning missing the mark. It's falling short of something. And in this particular parable, there is something that is offered, and that is the idea of sanctification. And now, I know that that's not something that you and I normally hear of in our world today. But it does, and it is, a disconnect from sin. And it's such a powerful and magnificent aspect of God's will for us in our life. Let me put it this way. First Thessalonians 4:3. This is the will of God, your sanctification. Or Acts 26:18, where Jesus is sending Paul forth. Open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. All right. You know, I'm going to talk a little bit about those verses. But first I want to say, you know what? I am floored, absolutely floored, that we're not Facebooking and theming this type of thing all over the place and tweeting about this magnificent aspect of the will of God. Sanctification. All right. And so let's open up, let's examine, let's look at these verses. In the Gospels, Jesus is continually saying, "Those who have eyes to see, let them see," or healing people who are blind or who have need to see. And it's obvious through this theme that it's a metaphor as well for being able to understand the relationship of Jesus and light, or seeing truly, which is what enlightenment means, to see truly. And Jesus being the light of the world for us, being that avenue, that way that you and I can see that which needs to be seen. All right. And so I think about it from this perspective. this image, it's such a major part of the Gospels, has to be a major part of something for you and I, and what's important in our lives is being able to see things truly. You know, the will of God is something that's personal for each of us, yes. But it's also about how you and I live together in society, as a nation. It's about the kind of life that you and I would like to live in, and the world that you and I would like to live in. For you and I to truly see a better world, honestly, it's going to ask and require that you and I seek and choose to become better at how we respond and how we live and how we choose and make the choices we do make in life, to be uplifted, to transform, and to make those things a part of our everyday response instead of just every now and then. So this verse is about Paul being called. It's his conversion. And Jesus is sending him forth to open the eyes and hearts, to open the minds and hearts, essentially, of all people to seeing with light and wisdom, which means basically turning to the light from the darkness. Darkness in this sense meaning ignorance and the energies of misunderstanding or condemnation or lack of connection to that which is greater. So to let go of our adverse ways, if you will, because that is what Satan really means, the adversary. So to move from adverse ways of living to God, to God's ways of life, to the nature of God. So from an adversarial nature to a holy nature. And take that nature on is that's the Christ consciousness, that Son of God, that is that part that God has given us, that we can not only aspire to, but each of us are children of God. Jesus said, do that which I have done, and you're going to do greater things even than that. He was saying, come on, follow me. He wasn't saying, worship, I'm all that. He was saying, do it. You can do it. You're meant to do it. It's just, it amazes me sometimes, the beauty of what Jesus offered and how our lives can be so full and so powerful and so much different, and our world so much different. To let go of adverse ways. And this verse is really referring to you and I experiencing a release of forgiveness. In other words, completely disconnecting. It's gone. All of our sin, gone. It's no longer. It's all of the tendrils of it, all of the guilt, all of the shames, all of the stuff. They're gone. And instead, it's replaced with something wonderful, beautiful, sweet, good. So imagine with me for a moment, you are not prayed up like young Billy, and you're working, you're stressed out. Some of us don't have to imagine too hard on this. There's a workload in front of you that is more than it has been, simply because either someone didn't show up for work because they're ill or whatever, or they've quit, and that all that they were doing, you're supposed to do. And of course, you're not going to be paid extra for it. And let's add in, your boss is very controlling. And you have a coworker who is trying to make your productivity be seen in a negative light. And just for good measure, we're going to add in, since you've been trying to exercise a little bit, you've got a foot injury. Trying to get rid of some of this stress, and the long line at the coffee shop, has brought you in right at the time you're supposed to be starting work. And instead of being able to take a moment to breathe and get ready to work, here you are. You're having to jump on it. And maybe you are so stressed out, you're not getting any sleep at night, so you're exhausted and you're weary. Then comes your first text or email that really just rubs you wrong. Okay. Now, I know none of you would be doing this, or have done this, but let's go on. How would you see yourself reacting? Have you disconnected from sin, and are you prayed up like young Billy? Or would you perhaps respond with negative energy, of maybe an angry retort or something demeaning? Who knows? But let's just imagine for a moment that you send out this angry response and regret it as soon as you hit send. I acknowledge, but I mean, maybe you don't. Maybe you wouldn't do that. But what if you did? Let's just also imagine that the majority of people in this world probably would have sent out that angry response as a result. Because the force of the adversary, if you will, that force of that adversarial nature is ingrained in so many ways. And it takes a true effort of spirit to make that change and to make something occur differently than what you and I would see happening in this moment. So let's talk about it this moment. My thoughts are, most of us would have fallen short. We would have sinned. And I want to share with you an aha moment that I hope you get. If you have fallen short, there is something down there for you to find. Okay. My experience shows me that the vast majority of all of the causes of that which causes us suffering, we call it evil, that which causes you and I suffering, is made from unwise choices or from all of the negative energies that we either make in our life or that someone else has made and you and I are suffering from. And I would offer this aha moment. An arrow has to be pulled back dramatically, really hard, in order to be shot forth. Okay. And when life is pulling you backwards, if you can, recognize that in that difficulties you are primed. You are ready to be shot forward with even greater power and even greater energy if you are able to focus what you are thinking about, whether you're focusing on the problem or focusing on the solution. And aligning yourself, all the choices you make, with that faith, with that energy of faith. Okay, so that's just my thought. Aligning ourselves with the solution, not the problem, is about you and I, from the perspective of our soul, taking that opportunity to achieve a higher consciousness. But for what purpose? Now this is really important, so please listen. Why should you and I make all the effort to seek a Christ consciousness? Because it takes work. I acknowledge that. It is in order to give form, life, and substance to our spiritual bodies. Jesus called it being born of spirit. And like any body, it needs continual sustenance in order to sustain life. These bodies are not our eternal being. It is our spiritual bodies that are the eternal being. And our souls have to form that and build it and be a part of that and encapsulate it in it. One of our co-founders, Charles Fillmore, says this of sanctification: It is the putting on of the nature of God and rising to the plane of dominion that gives one peace and satisfaction, the purity and holiness of the Christ consciousness. Now, Charles goes on to say, it embodies a knowledge of spirit that frees you and me from all limitations and points the way by which our mind and bodies may be bodies, but he's speaking of physical and spiritual, may be lifted up to the spiritual place of consciousness. It is a cleansing of the mind through Christ from thoughts of evil. Again, evil, that which causes us suffering. I ask you to think about that with me this morning. You may not be living in trying circumstances. You may not be trapped in a situation or a relationship that is draining or depleting. There are other ways you and I can be affected by sin that is made by the collective of humankind, because we have still to come forward in our consciousness as a people and as a race of beings. And that is things like, basically the main reason humanity needs to seek that higher consciousness. Things like, we're facing a shaky economy that is out of our hands. Or we're living in a society that is replete with inequities and injustices. Maybe you are even in a community that is blighted with depravity, people shooting one another, or you can't walk your street, whether it's day or night, safely. Maybe you're just simply overwhelmed by the warring world of your family and friends. Society is filled with problems, and many of them caused by sin. None of this needs to be the way it is. Hear that. None of this is God's will. Remember what we said earlier? God's will is our sanctification. How does being disconnected from that have anything to do with it? So it's not God's will. Reverend Eric Butterworth shares this thought from his book, Discover the Power Within. Christians talk about being saved, which usually implies being saved from society, saved from the rest of the pagan and evil world. In truth, no one can be saved from society. You and I must be saved with it, if at all. For what is society? Society is you and me. I ask you, take a breath and let yourself open to a different possibility for your life. Open to reclaiming the beauty and power of deliverance from sin and its consequences. Now I'm going to talk about that possibility in a moment, but let's take just a moment to understand deliverance from sin, missing the mark, and its consequences. Just to be clear, what are the consequences of sin? Here's a few. We succumb to feeling separate from God, one another, and living life full of illusions and limitations, condemning ourselves to a fruitless search of joy, true love, peace of heart and mind, seeing the temptations of greed, selfishness, powerlessness, pain, and suffering as life-giving rather than life-draining. Everything is energy, and our faith brings forth the energy of spirit, which is a powerful force. How we use our faith, either for seeking to live prayed up, so to speak, or in sin, depends on what we focus our faith on. Your thoughts begin it, your emotions amplify it, and your action increases its momentum. Viktor Frankl said between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. This space is all about the light of faith. This is where the disconnect from sin comes into play most importantly in our lives. It's about entering into a new kind of life, a life covenanted with God, living Christ, one of faith, sanctification, transformation. Now, some people may choose to focus on the idea that we could enter into this disconnect from sin by mental practices, by making that mental space larger by a couple of seconds or even a day or more, by taking some time to absorb the situation before we react, or to give ourselves time by thinking for a moment about how we want to, respond. So being judicious in our thought process. Think any way you want to think. It is an option that can never be taken from you. However, the kind of choice that offers you and I the most disconnect from sin with deliverance and transformation, the wisest and most strengthening, are the choices made knowing you and God are one. That clear connection to God, love, the Spirit of God. Because in loving, you keep consciously in that flow of God, of good, capable of bringing forth that light or the wisdom that is a part of Spirit's being that comes into our consciousness as we connect to bring faith into a situation, into our life, and into the world. So, back to the possibilities. What could they be? I'd like to share this thought. 1949, Charles Fillmore wrote some possibilities he saw for humankind. Excuse me. Broadcasting stations sending out on the ether light, heat, power will be established the world over, and every householder will have receiving sets which he can turn on or off at will. The cost will be negligible. Lighter than air forms of building material will be discovered, and our dwellings will float in the air and be transported from place to place like airplanes. Even the climate of the whole planet may be transformed, destructive forces no longer possible, and peace reign forever. Labor as we now have it will disappear. Production will become so easy that a person will in a week raise enough food to last them a year. Everybody will produce abundantly. Everybody will have everything they want, and no one will slave for wages. Art, science, religion, music, and the finer things of life will be for all people. Okay. Now those seem like some pretty wonderful thoughts. What kind of possibilities can you see? What type of society and world can you envision, can you help bring about? St. Teresa of Calcutta was the recipient of many of our world's most prestigious humanitarian awards. She's also the author of a book, No Greater Love. And she wrote this: "We must know that we have been created for greater things, not just to be a number in the world, not just to go for diplomas and degrees, this work or that work. We have been created in order to love and be loved." Can you see what a difference faith in a Christ consciousness plays in that all-important space about the choices you and I make in life? Sanctification is twofold. Deliverance and transformation, first of ourselves and then the world too. Think of this as a spiritual alignment, a connection of our minds and hearts, where our very thinking and feeling, every choice you and I make, comes from an automatic positive response, like a feeling of love, peace, strength, humility, completely disconnected from the negative energies that so many of us respond to automatically out of fear, greed, anger, despair. How? What brings it about? In Psalm 40, King David spoke of it this way. I waited patiently for Jehovah, and he brought me out of a pit. Jehovah means he who made that which has been made, or he who brought all existence, that which exists. The word from the Hebrew, wait, means to bind together. And it's not an acquiescent passivity where you're sitting around just simply waiting, doing nothing, holding your hands. That isn't what wait on the Lord means in this sense here. It implies the choice to turn on the light. It's like you and I reaching for that faith and making contact with that sense of love and that sense of God in us. And that pit is the same word that's used for hell or darkness. Sheol. And it implies that the whole thing is a life-affirming statement. It's about you and I connecting to that oneness of love and allowing ourselves to be lifted out of that hell or darkness and that pit that we can and have many of us found ourselves living in. And it's saying, I turn from the thoughts and feelings of separation to sanctification. Like letting God's transformation work inside me, because that's what happens. Our whole being, our will, our minds, our behaviors and our affections, our thought processes, they're all changed through the work of the Holy Spirit. Here's another ha moment I hope that you get. Joy is one of the best safeguards against temptation. Love is one of the best safeguards against a sense of separation from God and one another. And peace is essential to a heart and mind in order to bring forth good. So I will close with this thought. May you disconnect from sin, where you get to know, you get to sustain, you get to express and have a full life, that your own spiritual body is nurtured and birthed anew and brought into being in a Christ nature. God bless you. Thank you for being with me today.